July 1973, New Haven, Connecticut. In broad daylight, a young woman is brutally murdered in a downtown parking garage. Witnesses see the suspect escape. Forensics discover a trail of evidence, including blood and fingerprints. But it's not enough to capture the killer. Police turn to the world of the paranormal to help solve the case. A psychic's cryptic clues create more questions than answers. But will they catch the murderer and bring solace to a town cloaked in fear?
We had 5 people who had witnessed the portions of the incident as it occurred. We had the blood type, we had fingerprints, we had everything but his name and address.
Police even had a suspect, Penney's on-off boyfriend. Within hours of the murder, the man is brought in for questioning, and an eyewitness picks him out of a lineup.
However, he had an ironclad alibi. He had in excess of 12 witnesses who put him in a restaurant at a grill cooking.
With the release of the boyfriend, Mazzacane drew his own conclusion.
It was a random assault, and that this individual probably had a criminal record.
If Mazzacane is right, and it was a random act of violence, then there's little hope of a quick conviction. Meanwhile, the forensics team scour Penney's car for clues. Although the technology was pretty basic back in the 70s, they uncover a wealth of evidence.
There was a tissue box on the back seat, and there was a fingerprint on the tissue box. And then we found a handkerchief with the same blood on it, same type blood. Aside from the blood, there was Freon, which is used as a propellant in spray paint and auto body, and there was mechanics grease.
Freon, spray paint, and grease. It doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure it out. This is someone who gets his hands dirty working with cars. Mazzacane checks out hundreds of local mechanics, but he can't match the fingerprint. Overnight, New Haven becomes a ghost town. Women are afraid to go anywhere alone. Weeks turn into months. Live leads become dead ends. Mazzacane is frustrated and getting desperate. He makes a decision that most people might consider highly unusual. He decides to bring a psychic on board.
When you got to a point where an investigation becomes dead and you want to jumpstart it, you certainly would revert to a psychic.
Mazzacane gets in touch with Mary Pasquarella Downey, a psychic and time walker. She brings a new dimension to the investigation. For most people, the notion of time is just that, a notion, a means of measuring fragments of our lives. For Mary, time is personified, and she can talk to it.
When I discuss time as a time walker, time surrounds us, past, present, and future. Can't change time. You can move it around and play with it, but you can't change it. But the present past is something that's available. It's like a large library. If I'm dealing with time, it's like you pick a string up and then you begin to wind it like a ball. And the more you wind it, the larger the ball gets and the more information you compile. Time is like a moving camera. It takes pictures and retains things. And if you listen very carefully, time is like a verbal library. It gives you information. It defines things for you. Somebody asked me once what my impression was of time. And my impression of time is it's like a large ocean with lots of thought patterns that are boats floating in it. And if you really want to deal with it, you swim out to the boat, climb aboard, and gain whatever information you can get from that little boat. If I get an impression from time of a face, I'll draw a face.
Mary's drawing is similar to an eyewitness description of the killer, but it's not enough to nail him. She does, however, provide some important but cryptic clues.
I just knew blue was extremely important to the case because it kept repeating itself. It says blue is important, blue is important.
Blue, what? I said, what does blue tell me? Blue, well, let's think about this. I'm talking to myself. The car was blue. The incident occurred on the 8th and 10th level. Is there any blue up there? No. What does blue tell me? Was he wearing blue clothes? Did he have blue shoes on or a blue hat? No. Okay, so we'll file that. Blue.
Sure, the car was blue, and Penny's dress was blue, but it doesn't identify the killer.
I got the odor of oil, or like you would smell in a garage. So I tied that to the person and said to myself, well, this must be somebody that's a mechanic.
Amazingly, Mary had picked up on the mechanic connection. The fact that Mazzacane had been pursuing the possibility that a mechanic was involved had never been released to the public. And then the psychic provided a third cryptic clue.
Water kept repeating itself, and I thought to myself, well, this is New Haven. It's a harbor. You're surrounded by water. At that point, I thought, well, water's important to tell me that it happened here in New Haven. And I let it go at that.
Another non-starter. Doesn't every psychic see water?
I said, this is frustrating. She said, well, I can't tell you anything. I guess I was looking for some kind of an answer to the crime, to put me on, and she said, no, I don't do that.
Mary wouldn't be able to provide the detective with the kind of answers that he was looking for, but she did have insight into the problems with the case.
But I did say blood would tell, that the case would not be solved for years and years and years because the person was somebody that would just slip, very ordinary, and slip right through the cracks. And so it would be years before, but don't give up because blood would tell. I had no idea what that sentence meant at that time.
I said, do I have to wait for this guy to commit a crime? And then we go back to work? And she said, no, it's not going to be like that. She said, it's going to be a long time from now. So I said, oh, that's not very encouraging to myself, you know. No, I've got to prove her wrong or discard all her information or comments at that point.
It looked like the case would never be solved, but there was one man who was determined not to let that happen. Detective George Mazzacane was hunting down the brutal killer of Penney Serra. When he reached a dead end, he sought the help of professional psychic Mary Pasquarella Downey. Mary insisted that the killer would eventually be caught, but the visual clues she provided were vague. The color blue and a sense of water were not hard evidence. Certainly not something he'd want to share with his superiors.
I never committed this to writing because it would look like nonsense. And then one time I mentioned something in the detective division to someone, and the chief inspector said to me, you're not reading tea leaves anymore, are you? He said, I said, no. He said, well, when you get through with that, he says, I want you to go out and take care of something, get back to doing good old-fashioned police work.
Mazzacane decided to ignore the ridicule of his superior and continue working with Mary for two reasons. Firstly, conventional police work had yielded no positive results. Secondly, he was under pressure from Penny's father, John.
She said, I want to get more information on Penny. I want to hold one of her objects. Did you bring anything with you? I said, no. She said, well, I need some significant part of clothing. The dress she wore that day. I said, I'll get something. So I went back after this was a brief conversation. And I was interested, but I wasn't, I didn't have anything to chew on, you know? It was like, you know, like a light beer, I guess. Everything you wanted and less, you know? I guess they have to characterize it that way, you know? There's a lot there, but... And I wasn't surprised. I was interested.
For their second meeting, Mazzacane brought Penny's father along. John Serra had campaigned to keep this case alive from day one. Every week, he placed ads in local papers in an attempt to find the killer.
He did not want it put on the shelf and wait 20 years for someone to come in and confess to a crime. He wanted to know that there was somebody working on this case every day. And that was his mission, and he accomplished that.
Mazzacane also brought a favorite coat of Penny's. The process of psychic reading through an object is known as psychometry.
When you walk into a house, you either get a good feeling or a bad feeling. When you meet somebody, you either like them or you're wary of them. That's your energy reaching out to protect you. And it's exactly the same as any viewer that's out there has had the deja vu, that's had met somebody and been cautious, that's gone into a house and couldn't wait to get out. This is psychometry. That's the world of psychometry. It's energy speaking.
She began to talk about Penny and what kind of a woman she was and what she thought had happened, and kind of recapped what she had told me.
The only thing that we did get from that was that I knew very well that it was somebody that had never seen her before, had nothing to do with her, and that it was just a chance occurrence. Wrong place, wrong time.
Mazzacane's suspicions are confirmed. Right from the start, he also felt the killing was random. After the session, Mazzacane and Penny's father had their own meeting.
I said, what do you think after we left? I said, did you feel comfortable? Did you think she's a quack? Where did she get all this information? How did she? He says, I don't know. He said, but she's good. He said, I believe her. He said, if she can help, I'd like her involved. So I said, okay. She had suggested that she wanted to go to the crime scene and get some impressions of the person who did this. So he was all for that. He said, sure. And I thought it was a good idea. We'd come this far. Why leave that part undone?
It's been over a year since Penny Serra was murdered. Conventional police work has produced nothing. Out of sheer desperation, Mazzacane continues to put his faith in Mary.
And this is actually where it happened?
Yes, right in this area here was where she bolted from the car and ran.
Can this odd couple manage to grasp some psychic evidence from the crime scene and not only capture a brutal killer, but bring some solace to a heartbroken father?
What witnesses said, he chased her up this way and then she ran. She was looking around. She said, I've got a terrible headache. She says, I'm getting an awful headache on this side. I said to myself, what has that got to do with anything? Where's that going to lead me? Why was she getting a headache in the area where this guy was standing, where he was observed? Is there a logical explanation for that?
When we got to the garage, the perpetrator began to become more clear to me as far as what he was like and who he was. So basically, I saw him in a uniform. I smelled the gas. I knew that he worked with a garage. I saw him wiping his hands on an oily rag, and I saw a uniform with a name tag with the letter E on it. And I knew that he worked in a garage. He was probably a mechanic. He was thin. He was wiry. He weighed maybe 160, 65 pounds tops, and that he had the injury to his head.
I mean, that's a lot to digest and sleep on. I mean, you'd be talking in your sleep if you got hit with all that at once.
For Madzikane, returning to the crime scene raises more questions than answers.
My primary questions were what actually did happen and what really was in this man's mind at the time of this murder. And that's what this revisiting stirs in me.
While we were in the garage, one of the things that was you were very aware of is that you're dealing with a girl that was very lovely. Penney Serra was like a little rainbow. She reminds me so much of one of my children. Logical, reasonable, common sense, sweet and understanding. You could picture her fighting to stay alive. That was the one thing that really began to get to me, is I knew she fought to stay alive. And that really disturbed me. And I wondered why hadn't anybody heard her, because I know she would have cried out.
I don't want to make this sound like I had a religious experience. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. It was just a feeling that I had. I felt that she was getting information from a gift that she had. And I never felt that with another person in my life before. And I've worked with some psychics before, and I've worked with some after. And I never got that feeling, you know, that I was going to get help or I was going to get that kind of, you know, it never happened again.
From the very onset of getting the case, I knew that blue was extremely important. Blue, 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 kept repeating. And then as we approached the garage, I knew that where we were going would be the blue floor. So as we entered the garage and George was driving up, I noted that there were numbers on the floor. So I thought I was wrong.
Later on, I checked with one of the attendants, and he did say that years ago, they did color code the floors, but then they changed it to a numeric format.
So I was right.
So she was right.
So I was right,
Yeah.
and then it was blue.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Another confirmation.
I had the feeling that this woman knew something. And I honestly thought that she was going to tell me who did it. Go get this guy. Here's his name. I wrote it down in the address. It was scary in that someone could know that kind of information and not have enough to take you over the top. That was frustrating.
Mary's visit to the parking garage had produced several new clues. However, every psychic has their limit.
I'm not involved beyond the point of my first initial investigation. There are a lot of psychics that have the same philosophy that I have, that we are not going to solve a murder case. We are not police. We are going to be an informant, somebody that informs them of something that that they may have missed or not paid attention to. A good psychic will only do what they're asked to do and nothing more, and walk away.
Detective Madzikane continues working on the Penney Serra case. Years pass with no significant progress. Then, in 1979, Madzikane decides that he too has reached his limit. After 17 years with the New Haven Police Department, the detective retires.
I just hit a stone wall, I think. I just hit the wall. And I was getting totally consumed with this. And Mary had given me all these leads, but I needed something to put everything together, and I just couldn't. I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying that it got to a point where I just, I didn't feel like I was useful anymore.
With Madzikane out of the picture, one of Mary's predictions has already come true. 5 years have passed since the murder, and the case still hasn't been solved. In fact, it would be another 6 years before there's a break in the case. A woman calls the police and claims that her husband threatened to do the same thing to her as he'd done to Penney Serra. The man is arrested and charged with Penney's murder. Is this the man Mary Downey saw in her visions? Will John Serra finally get justice? Because although it's been 11 years, the statute of limitations doesn't apply to murder. After one of the largest homicide investigations in New Haven history, a suspect is about to go on trial for the murder of Penney Serra. Before a word of evidence is heard, the retired detective who spent 5 years working the case has reached his own verdict.
I just knew he was not guilty. We had already checked this guy out 3 or 4 years ago. He had an alibi, he was working that day.
Mazzacane was right. On the eve of the trial, the prosecutor made a startling announcement. The suspect's blood was type A. The blood found at the crime scene was type O. Case dismissed. The man was fully exonerated, but the damage was done. His life would never be the same. It's only in movies the wrongly accused walk away smiling. Once again, the Penney Serra case goes cold. Years pass. Fortunately for this case and many others, in the early 90s, the landscape of police work in America would change forever with the creation of a computerized fingerprint database. One of the first prints uploaded onto the new system is from the box of tissues found in Penney Serra's car. Because of the backlog with the new system, it took 3 years to find a match. The guy's name, Grant. First name, Edward.
And I saw a uniform with a name tag with the letter E on it.
The letter E for Edward, exactly as Mary predicted, and at one point Grant had fixed cars for a living, another prediction of Mary's that proved absolutely accurate. Grant had been arrested in 1994 on a domestic violence rap. He had no prior convictions.
The person was somebody that would just slip, very ordinary, and slip right through the cracks.
Once again, Mary was spot on. For all intents and purposes, Grant was a clean, living, nondescript citizen.
Don't give up because blood would tell.
Mary Downey couldn't possibly have known what blood would tell meant, because when she predicted it more than 20 years ago, forensic DNA technology didn't exist. And it transpired that on the day of the murder, Grant had been to the nearby Veterans Administration Hospital to receive treatment for an old head injury.
This guy's got 3 plates in his head. 30 years later, you find she was getting his headache. She was telling me this almost 30 years earlier.
All of Psychic Mary Downey's predictions had hit the mark. But what about the vision of water? The one clue both Mazzacane and Mary dismissed. It turns out Grant lived in the nearby town of Waterbury. As for Grant, the fingerprint match allowed police to get a blood sample so that his DNA could be compared to blood found at the crime scene. It, too, was a positive match.
I just couldn't believe it, but I could believe it. And I knew it was him.
On Thursday, June 24th, 1999, almost 26 years after the crime was committed, Edward R. Grant was arrested for the murder of Penney Serra. In September 2002, he was sentenced to serve 20 years in prison. He won't be eligible for parole until he's 80 years old. Up to the end, Grant maintained his innocence, so we may never know why Penney Serra was murdered. The tragic irony of this story is that Penney's father, John Serra, a man who had devoted more than 20 years of his life trying to help bring the killer to justice, died just 8 months before Grant was caught.
I could see John going to heaven and saying to God, "Now listen, God, it's been all these years, and Mary said that this was going to be solved, so I want it solved." And God said, "Okay, we'll take care of it." And that's what happened.
They say truth is stranger than fiction, and in this case, the truth was very, very strange.